34-year-old middleweight showstoppers coming up this weekend, and some guys that more than likely had their best days in other organizations. We have the former welterweight and middleweight champ from the ACB in Albert Duraev, and he's going to be looking to take on Chidi Bang Bang and Njokuani. Matt, this fight is a lot of fun, and for Albert Duraev in both of his fights in the UFC, they've been bonkers, and I don't know if maybe changes in barometric or atmospheric pressure really affect Albert Duraev all that well, because in the first round that he had against Joaquin Buckley, one eye started to puff up, and then in the second round, the other eye started to puff up. And in his fight against Roman Kopylov, if you go back and watch that one, well, the same thing can be said. His eye puffed up really, really bad. Duraev has puffy eyes when they get hit.
He's, well, you know who he's like. Kell Brook is the automatic person I think of. Gennady Golovkin broke his orbital, comes back 6 months later. You know what Earl Spence Jr. does? Breaks the same darn orbital, because that's the interesting thing. Like, the Diaz brothers, people talk about that a lot with scar tissue. Injuries do seem to be reoccurring, especially with the damage on people's faces. Like, this isn't baseball where you just have to worry about sliding the wrong way and you might roll your ankle. Injuries do seem to be reoccurring, and I am interested to see if that eye will continue to pop up against Njokuani, who can really throw damaging strikes.
Well, and if you do look at it, it's the biggest Clash of Styles fight that you're going to find in this card, because for Albert Duraev, I don't know why he decided to just kickbox with Joaquin Buckley. I know they talked about it in the fight that they had both trained together before, and there was a lot of bad blood going into it. But Duraev, even on his entries for the takedowns, he was able to have a little bit of success up against the cage, but Buckley was able to pop right back up. And if there's any negative about Buckley, yeah, there's big actions, but his takedown defense can suffer in certain fights. And for as good as Duraev is at locking those hands, dumping you down, and chaining together his takedowns, it was a little bit of a surprise that that's where he wasn't able to find the success against a guy like Buckley. And Duraev's one of those weird cases where he was so good with ACB. He was 8-0, he's a double champ, but making the weight at welterweight was too tough, so then he was forced up to middleweight. He took a really long time off from 2018, the Piotr Struss win, to then taking on Caio Bittencourt over on Contender Series, and Duraev was a minus 400 favorite against Bittencourt, roughly a minus 400 favorite against Kopylov, and a minus 225 favorite against Joaquin Buckley. So giant favorite in a lot of these matchups. Obviously, he had wins over UFC level talent outside of the UFC. He beat Clifford Starks with ACB. He also had a win in his third pro fight against Xavier Fupa, you know, fat upper pubic area. Pokam, who had 2 fights in the UFC, he beat him in his third pro fight. Xavier was already in the UFC to that point, so that was kind of crazy to see from Duraev. But you know the skills are there. He's going to throw a lot of big hooks to try and close the distance, to get his takedowns, and mount some heavy offensive ground and pound. We saw that in the Kopylov fight. You saw that when he was an ACB champ. For Chidi Njokuani, you talk about Bellator main events. You talk about the fights that he's had in the UFC. Okay, Chidi Njokuani, UFC debut, performance bonus. Second fight out, performance bonus. Last fight, fight of the night. And he went out there against Gregory Rodriguez, and on the first takedown attempt, landed that knee up the middle that cut Gregory in the center, and for the rest of the fight, up until Gregory finished it, Mark Smith's eyes were glued on Gregory's bone between his eyeballs. Have
you seen the new Doctor Strange movie?
No.
Well, that's how it ends. He gets like an eye. That's what it looked like. Like, Chidi Njokuani landed one of the more damaging non-knockout strikes you are ever going to see, and somehow lost the fight, which is very interesting. I do think you have to break it down, because there's some fighters we talk about to where, hey, when they fight tired, they're still pretty much the same fighter, right? You can tell that they might not be fighting at 100% peak capacity, but the strikes that they throw are still the same variety of strikes. They still incorporate the kick, and I think that's the most telling thing about a lot of fighters. Think about Dan Hooker. Dan Hooker is a very technical striker who has fought in main events, has good cardio, and can fight 5 rounds. Dan Hooker starts all of his fights kicking a lot, then kicks less, and then wrestles as the fights normally go on, because kicks do take a lot of energy to keep on throwing throughout your fights. The thing about Njokuani is, when he incorporates the kicks into his combinations, he is as dangerous as anybody from open space in the octagon.
Which could play out well in the first round against Duraev, because the first big action that Buckley had was a full-force head kick to Duraev, whose hand was down, and he ate it like it was
nothing. And there's definitely some parallels between Joaquin Buckley and Chidi Njokuani. Now, frame-wise, they're not similar at all. That has to be said. 100%. Njokuani, kind of a thin guy, more upright with his style and his posture.
One of the longest reaches in the middleweight division.
But he blasts a lot more kicks too. With Joaquin Buckley, he'll load up and throw kicks, but they're not as organically as his combinations. Whereas Njokuani will throw to left hand, not really even trying to throw anything on it, just to set up the kick behind it. And I agree with you. I think those kicks and those combinations are going to be not easy for him to land in the first round, but they will be definitely open earlier on in the fight. But this is one of those fights where I favor Njokuani almost like heavily as the fight begins. Like I could see him going out there and just starching Duraev quite quickly, but every second that ticks off this clock is like an hourglass. And Njokuani's at the top, Duraev's in the bottom. So I do worry about just the lasting power of Njokuani, because when he gets tired, now granted that normally happens after he throws a lot of potential fight-ending strikes, and he probably would have knocked out anybody not named Gregory Rodriguez in that matchup. I just worry about if he's on the receiving end of some takedown attempts, if he's not able to get that distance and really let his hands go, what is he going to be able to do on the in-betweens? Because the in-betweens are probably going to win him this fight, and I just don't know if he has enough there.
And it really is tough because Njokuani at the start, at the first round of that fight against Gregory Rodriguez, he showed really good takedown defense. And then in the second round, it was Rodriguez with kind of a hip toss and Njokuani on bottom. And then as Rodriguez softened him up with strikes, and Njokuani just kind of held on. And it looked like one of his legs was a little bit trapped there, but didn't really show much wherewithal to get out of the way. And for both these guys, to talk about the level of competition outside of the UFC, for Chidi Njokuani at welterweight, I mean, I'm going down through it.
Brandon Thatch, one of the all-time greats.
Brandon Thatch, Jeremy Kimball, we've got Max Griffin as a win, Ricky Rainey, you've got Andrea Fialho, Melvin Gillard, Andre Koreshkov, Izaki Kato, you've got John Salter, the loss, but that guy's a grappling ace over there, Jim. Rafael Carvalho, the former longtime middleweight champ over with Bellator. So a lot of really good names on the record of Njokuani, and the biggest thing can be said for both of these guys. They both struggled to make welterweight. Duraev was forced up. Chidi Njokuani, bad weight cuts made him sound like me before, to then sounding like Barry White, like he sounds right now. He's got one of the most sultry voices in MMA, but the joke aside, it was due to the weight cutting. That's what changed his voice quite a bit. So he's not quite like his brother Anthony, where it's all striking all the time, can't defend the takedowns. Chidi is better in some of those in-betweens. But against a guy like Duraev, you can see Njokuani's kickboxing style, and a guy who trains at a Sykes and Janjira Muay Thai struggle against a guy like Duraev in that respect. So I mentioned that Duraev in his last 3 fights was a giant favorite. He is the underdog in this matchup, so that might intrigue some people. We saw somebody like, Abubakar Nurmagomedov recently. Exactly. Giant favorite for pretty well all of his career. His last time out, he was due the underdog. But we look at this, and Njokuani's the favorite. We have a look at the Topology votes, Matt. People don't like puffed up eyes, so I'm going to say over under 70% of Njokuani.
I think they'll be over.
If they're going to be over, they are over. 731 total votes, 85% of Njokuani, 90% by knockout. For the 15% that have Duraev, 49% by decision, and 28% by submission. Who do you have in the matchup?
I have the underdog, actually, because I'm trying not to let recency bias get into my mind. And I know those were big shots that Njokuani landed against Rodriguez, but Gregory Rodriguez is a fighter who we talk about his grappling a lot. Do we see his grappling a lot in the UFC? Like, is it at the forefront of his game like it is his boxing, his power shots? Not necessarily. And I do worry about Duraev and his ability to eat those shots, especially early on in the fight. I cannot stress that red flag any more than I am right now, but I think you can get a little bit clouded with your judgment based on his last performance against Joaquin Buckley, who I actually think Joaquin Buckley's a decent fighter. Like, I know the peaks are high, the valleys are low, but in the middle there's a pretty decent fighter. So for those reasons, and I'm going to look stupid on Saturday when this fight's over, I have Albert Duraev in the matchup.
Give me Chidi Bang Bang and Njokuani. I mean, Albert Duraev cannot roll with the punches at all. Like, even in the fight that he had against Roman Kopylov, as it went on, Kopylov, I mean, his nose was melted like a stick of butter in the first round, but as it went on, he brought himself back into the fight. So I do like Chidi Njokuani in the fight. We'll see if that adrenaline dump does play a factor in this one, because Duraev's the type of guy that can fight on somewhat of a line in these fights. So we're split on the pick. I'm going with Chidi Bang Bang and Njokuani. Matt going with Albert Duraev. Let us know down below in the comments section who you have. Vera taking on Sandhagen in the main event. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say,
let's get into it.